Hello. In this video clip, I want to talk about new ways of thinking about work organisations. In the previous video clips, I talked about organisational structure and organisational culture, both massively important ways of thinking about organisations that have influenced the ways that organisations have been structured over the last 100 years. But in more recent years, quite a lot of authors, management consultants, managers themselves and academics have started to write as if work is radically changing and that new forms of technology, new ways of understanding what work is and the relationship between organisations and people are changing entirely the rather perhaps industrial revolution view of work that dominated for the past 100 years. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those claims, but I also want to relate these to ideas of structure and culture too. One of the common ways of thinking about new forms of work organisation is that there are different ways of thinking about organisational structure. So what we see, for example, is a sustained hostility to the idea of the large bureaucratic, or as it's sometimes called, Fordist organisation. The idea here is that these large, massive organisations are in a sense a bit like old industrial dinosaurs now. And what we should be looking for in an increasingly turbulent set of international markets is small, agile organisations with flexible forms of structure. These forms of flexibility are talked about in a variety of different ways. In terms of organisational structure, very often some form of functional flexibility might be imagined. So rather than the rigid Christmas tree, the pyramid of hierarchy and authority that Weber was talking about, what we have are a set of writers who stress the possibility that organisational structure could be bent, could be changed, could be reimagined. So the organisation, rather than being a big Christmas tree, might be something rather more like an amoeba or perhaps a mobile, a set of relationships that are continually moving around with different projects and teams coalescing in order to work on particular kinds of tasks, but then dispersing once those tasks have been carried out. So in that sense then, it would seem, if those writers are correct, that we're entering an era in which organisational structure is not nearly as important as it was, in which organisational structure is in a sense a much more contingent, much more flexible way of thinking, rather than the rigid sets of rules and instructions that Weber and Taylor were writing about. Now, at the same time, we also have a different way of thinking about the commitment and value that employees and managers place on their organisations. An increasing number of writers are talking about the ways in which employees are now seeking meaning and worth from their work. So these employees are people, if these writers are right, who are going to work expecting to find the sorts of values and commitments. Some writers even talk about notions of love and spirituality or community and so on, that they might have previously found outside their work organisations. So this seems to echo much of the writing on organisational culture. The idea that instead of treating people as rather soulless robots, we should be treating them as full human beings who are seeking all sorts of values and commitment and affirmation within their work organisations. Now, one of the very interesting things about much of this writing is how many times people are claiming now that these new forms of work organisation, whether we think of them in structural or cultural terms, are in a sense leading us into a new era of work organisation or even economy. For example, since the 1970s, a variety of authors have talked about the idea of post-industrialism, the idea that the vast majority of work being conducted within modern economies will no longer be based on the old industrial paradigm, the sort of paradigm that Weber and Taylor inhabited, but instead will be based on a new kind of knowledge economy. Another way of articulating this that became popular slightly later than the 1970s, I suppose the 80s and 90s, was the idea of the postmodern organisation, an organisation that was no longer in the era of modernity, but instead was inhabiting a new postmodern time. And this postmodern time, again, was primarily concerned with the production of symbols rather than the creation of actual artifacts, actual products. A similar articulation of these ideas was often called Post-Fordism. So you had the notion of the old Fordist era, in a sense, being supplanted by a post-Fordist era, based on new kind of job design principles and so on. Now, all these ideas are slightly different, but they share one deep underlying similarity. That's the idea that work now has changed and is somehow different from the sorts of work that people were conducting in previous eras. Now, we might well accept that this is the case. We may well believe, along with lots of these authors, that there are somehow modern forms of work and management that are superior to the sorts of forms of work and management that existed in previous times. And indeed, an enormous number of people, again, consultants and academics and business gurus and so on, make a lot of money by selling this idea, by telling managers, convincing business organizations that there are special tools and techniques, forms of human resource management, ways of thinking about strategy and so on, that are required in this incredibly turbulent e-business global economy. Now that may be the case, but I want to introduce a certain note of scepticism. If we go back to the ideas of culture and structure, we can start to see how it's very difficult to imagine any form of organisation without thinking about it in cultural or structural terms. For example, could an organisation exist without any structure? Many of the proponents of the new forms of work organisation seem to be suggesting that might be the case. But can you imagine any organisation that didn't have certain sets of rules? Sets of rules about what kinds of jobs people were supposed to be conducting, about how much people were going to get paid and who was going to pay them, about how you got promoted, about when you took time off for Christmas, or whatever. Any of these matters require sets of rules. Indeed, I would argue that the definition of a work organisation is that it must be constituted, at least partly, by a set of formal rules. Now, it may well be that these formal rules aren't of the same character as the factory rules I used in the very first video clip on structure. However, they are still formal rules. And it's all very well for management consultants and gurus to say that they're no longer important, but they seem to me to be constitutive of any understanding of organisation. But we can say the same kind of things about culture too. Could we imagine an organisation that was purely a culture? Could we imagine an organisation that was glued together entirely by a set of beliefs and commitments and values? Now that seems to be a very unlikely proposition. The closest, I think, that we probably get to an organisation like that would be something like a family, perhaps what we might call a community. This would be some way of thinking about a group of individuals who were held together by a particular set of common ties, perhaps of mutual affection or mutual understanding or whatever. But these sorts of organisations are usually very different to the kind of formal organisations that we're describing in business textbooks. Those sorts of organisations are necessarily places which require an employment contract of some kind. You know, it's all very well saying that you're going to love your employees and your customers and all the rest of it, but a very important component of going to work is getting pay and status and recognition through those kinds of work organisations. So what I'd like to emphasise here, and move towards a conclusion, is by suggesting that a careful thinking through of the concepts of organisational culture and structure might lead us to be a little sceptical about many of the extremely inflated claims that have been made about new forms of work organisation. If we think we can exist in an entirely virtual, flexible work economy, we may well be kidding ourselves. And in any case, if we look at statistics and the evidence of our eyes, we can see that an enormous amount of work in contemporary societies, even the most developed societies, is still conducted according to essentially Taylorist or McDonaldized principles. So even if it could be the case that we could exist in virtual work organisations, the moment it clearly isn't. But I would suggest that following the arguments I've made in the 3 video clips here, that the idea of an organisation which had no structure is almost incoherent. Indeed, I'd suggest it's probably a definitional impossibility. Thanks for listening.